So welcome everyone. We're super happy to have you here. Let me start actually by giving a big thank you to Eric for having accepting our invitation to co-present this webinar with me. So thank you very much, Eric. All right, the goal of this webinar is to talk about the urgent need for organizations to not only increase their identity security, but even more importantly, modernize it. You might be asking why, and I actually like to use an analogy with a well-known security area, like the endpoint security. Looking back, it all started as disconnected, almost like disjoint set of technologies that over time not only evolved to look into much more than just preventative perspective, but also into, again, the assumed breach detection response, but everything in a unified way. Again, we're looking nowadays into solutions that combine both EPP and EDR together. By the way, the same thing is happening exactly in the cloud space with emerging technologies like CWPP, CSPM, SIEM, all coming together under CNAPP. By the way, a lot of acronyms here, but I'll assume that some of those might be known to you. CNAPP, by the way, is Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. So the same thing is happening on the identity space, and it must so if we want to effectively increase our overall identity security and prevent the ongoing slew of attacks against it. So our objective today is to go through a view on the threat landscape, the challenges when it comes to protecting an identity platform, and finally looking into recommended actions and overall identity security direction. All right, so Eric, the floor is yours. Take it away. Excellent. Oh, by the way, apologies. I skipped the agenda slide, but I kind of gave the sneak peek to the agenda slide anyways. So let's go.
Awesome. Thank you, Antonio. So first, let's take a quick look at how the cybersecurity industry is addressing core challenges we have today. So the red line here shows threats increasing exponentially. And I remember when the MITRE ATT&CK framework was released nearly 10 years ago, which is crazy to think about that it was almost 10 years ago. And there used to be 20 to 30 techniques across just the Windows operating system. Now we have hundreds of techniques across multiple operating systems, multiple platforms. And if you dig deeper into those, there are multiple threat actor groups leveraging all of those techniques, additional vulnerabilities, and more, because TAs are recognizing that cybercrime is and has been extremely profitable. Now, the blue line is a bit subjective, depending on the organization. I understand that not many organizations have an unlimited budget, and it's linear because it's oftentimes ineffective and mostly reactive rather than proactive. So what's happening here? We're spending $250 billion in cybersecurity. Full breach life cycles from start to finish are into the months, and our security teams are just way overwhelmed. The SOC analysts have a ton of alerts. There's GRC people that have a lot of auditing work to do, and teams are being overwhelmed. So this increased complexity ultimately results in a reduction in effectiveness. So let's break down that blue line of resourcing into core components, especially as it relates to identity. Next slide. So as you can see from the numbers, Active Directory has a massive attack surface. 90% of organizations use Microsoft Active Directory. And as you saw from the poll at the beginning of the call, these numbers are pretty accurate. And why? It's because Active Directory is the industry standard. It's scalable and moderately easy to manage, maybe not so much easy to secure, but easy to manage. And it just works with a huge number of applications across the enterprise. If your organization's been around for 5, 10 years or longer, you likely use Active Directory, and it's difficult to transition off of, even if you wanted to. So these numbers should also look familiar for other reasons. So remember the drive to lift and shift on-prem applications to the cloud a few years back? So that's what's happening here. And as a result, that typically means a hybrid environment. So Active Directory almost guaranteed at this point, with a mix of other solutions as seen in that poll. So next slide. So it would not be a cybersecurity webinar without some mention of ransomware. So things change often with these ransomware gangs. What I do want to point out here is that Conti has recently disbanded into 6 groups with different specializations and focus. But the commonality here across all of these ransomware groups is that they target identity in some form or fashion. So if you look at the bottom right of the slide here, you'll see credential dumps being used to access legitimate resources. Phishing, still very prevalent today. And then also an up-and-coming mechanism for gaining initial access, exploiting vulnerabilities, especially if it's related to an external application. So what happens here is with this initial access, identity is taken, privilege escalation occurs, and then lateral movement into the network happens. And then often that target is crown jewels up to and including Active Directory. So majority of threat actors target Active Directory. And that's what I'm seeing in a lot of my cases today. Next slide. Now let's talk about security challenges. So 78% of organizations experienced direct business impacts due to identity-related breaches. And if we take a closer look at these security challenges on the right side of the screen, we'll see several, starting with B2B and that inherent trust. So with business to business, business to consumer, there's that inherent trust that when you're connecting to their network or vice versa, you're kind of hoping for the best and assuming that they do not have a compromised network and that there aren't credentials that could potentially move laterally from their environment into yours. So that's one of the bigger concerns with identity. Additionally, cloud environments are also succumbing to identity security challenges. So I remember doing a incident response engagement for a Fortune 500 company. And what happened was an AWS access key was provisioned for programmatic access via a third-party monitoring application. And so that access key ended up surfacing in a credential dump because that third-party monitoring solution ended up being compromised. So threat actor got a hold of that access key and then was able to access what was monitored, which in this case was an S3 bucket. Obviously, when we're talking about identity, it's not always about on-prem, it's also about cloud environments, Azure, GCP, AWS, as I just mentioned, and other. Next, we have living off the land techniques. So the interesting thing here is that it's extremely difficult to detect. So I mentioned MITRE ATT&CK framework. There's also living off the land binaries and resources. And then when you combine that with the use of legitimate credentials, it makes detecting attacker activity extremely difficult because it looks like normal activity. We have these threat actors just using whatever they find on systems to, privask or to move laterally or to gain access to Active Directory and other resources. And it just looks legitimate, just like a normal user would. So you kind of have to do some anomaly and behavior type detections there. And then we also, of course, have general poor basic security hygiene. We have MFA and password policies or lack thereof, and then inadequate privilege access management. Next slide. So this slide is showing 3 very common scenarios of identity-based attacks, starting with the most common there. So an external service brute force or a legitimate username and password combination from a credential dump. Still very prevalent today, still seen oftentimes in incident response scenarios. We also have scenario B where the threat actor creates malicious OAuth applications to then lure users, oftentimes via phishing. And then lastly, privileged identity account takeover into enumeration and disabling of security tools, which is always a challenge, especially if they have system privileges or highly privileged capabilities where they can disable those tools. Sometimes in all 3 of these cases, it's a combination, right? You might have the capability of a malicious OAuth application being registered, and then a phishing attack happens, which then leads into lateral movement, targeting Active Directory or other applications, and then the disabling of security applications. So it could be a combination of all 3 of these, but again, these are all extremely common and ones I see oftentimes in different engagements. Next slide. So this slide, again, highlights some of the core security challenges with modern identity. We discussed the challenges a bit on a previous slide. So here you can see some of the requirements to address them. So with identity posture that I mentioned, you oftentimes have IAM solutions, cloud environments, you'll have posture management, configuration management, and those sorts of tools. Complex attacks, you'll often need to leverage EDRs or SIM and those sorts of detection capabilities, and so on and so forth. Although this slide is focusing on technology, we can't overlook people and processes, right? So tech by itself won't take you to your destination. So it's important to understand all components of your security program as you address identity challenges. Next slide. All right, now let's talk about a real world example that I often see on many engagements. So specifically, let's visually analyze a kill chain attack against identity, and then I'll share some identity related assessments from this example. So as it turns out, end users like to reuse credentials to include their work credentials. So as we can see here, malicious attachments and then install of malware. That malware will then provide additional passwords that can be used later in attacks. We also have the capability and use of social engineering phone calls or other malware distribution networks from the attackers. So a couple different mechanisms there. And then last, we have those stolen or weak credentials used for remote desktop protocol access, web application access, sometimes SSH access on those external systems, and then even easier in some cases, just a flat out exploitation of vulnerabilities on external assets. Next, as you can see here on the screen currently, is an escalation of privileges via Kerberos, Mimikatz, brute force, etc. DC Sync is one that I want to briefly discuss before we move on, because it's something that I see almost all the time on engagements now. So DC Sync effectively impersonates a domain controller and requests an account password data from the target domain controller. This is a feature within Windows for synchronization between domain controllers. And so this happens by nature, but attackers can leverage that capability via DC Sync. What happened was sort of an evolution. So lots of folks know about the Curb TGT password hash to create a golden ticket or access the DC directly and dump the Active Directory database file, the ntds.dit, and then utilize that for a golden ticket. It's really easy now with DC Sync. So it's something we're seeing pretty often now. And then last, we have the legitimate channels. Here on screen means deploying encryptors with GPO or other means. Sometimes there's automated propagation with something like PsExec. So if the threat actor has legitimate credentials, they can then use a tool like PsExec to drop a batch file or something similar onto multiple systems and then execute that malware, ransomware the systems, exfiltrate, all the above. So GPO or automated propagation happens quite often now. And this is a common attack path, right? Especially as it relates to ransomware and the malicious use of identity. So how does this happen? Next slide. So this is sort of the money shot and some pretty scary stuff. This is based on research using Ranger AD across 50 different organizations. So some of these are commonly known and used techniques by threat actors, such as weak Kerberos TGT or golden ticket, weak admin accounts, or DC Sync, like I just mentioned on the previous slide. So I won't go into those, but what I do want to highlight here, because it's sort of a anomaly for a lot of folks, is the dangerous rights delegation. So as you can see on the far left there, what happens is an administrator can go into ADUC, Active Directory users and computers, and delegate permissions such as reset user passwords, create, delete, manage groups, manage group policy. You can see how some of these permissions are ones that a threat actor might want. And when you do this, you want to delegate the proper rights to the appropriate groups. Don't provide an attacker the ability to backdoor AD through a server admin account, for example. So enforcing the principle of least privilege by creating custom roles and tiering out responsibilities and their corresponding OUs is extremely important. So you can see some pretty crazy stuff here. Next slide. So now I'm going to pass it to Antonio to discuss security requirements.
Thank you, Eric. That was awesome. So now that Eric went through a end-to-end view on the attack surface, the threat landscape, and finally the identity security challenges that organizations are facing, I would like to share our view on what organizations would require or should be focusing on from a technology perspective in order to try to solve exactly those same challenges. First, let us have a look at how typically identity security components are distributed. You can see exactly a lot of these pillars probably mean something to you, and you have them within your own organizations. Again, you most definitely are doing identity access management. You might not actually be doing privilege access management, although it's increasing or increasingly known or used component within organizations. But to our right there, specifically identity threats detection and response, and even more continuous assessment, continuous assessments might be actually something which is not that common. Now, you could have all of these components. What is jumping really to the eye is how all of them are working in silos and not actually ensemble, ensuring that all of the insights, knowledge of configurations, policies being applied, usage of identity is actually being used across all of these pillars. And now, what is even more perceptible is when you actually jump outside of that identity security domain and look into other security domains. Let's look into the endpoint, for example. So what is happening here is that typically all of these security pillars will operate independently. And again, what is within the realm of the endpoint remains there, or what is within the realm of identity security, and often even just like identity management by itself remains there. What this creates is, again, gaps, detection gaps, which translates typically into things like loss of visibility, lack of context into those detections, which in the end results in diminished overall security. And like Eric was actually mentioning, SOC teams are already overloaded with the amount of alerts. What we don't want even more is just more false positives or alerts that eventually are missing the link and missing the context for a SOC analyst to actually know what happened and not having to manually stitch the context, right? Exactly because it's missing that cross-domain context for correlation and verification. So what eventually might be seen as a benign activity or an activity that is somewhat below a given threshold for it to be marked as suspicious or malicious would eventually not be detected, right? And eventually not be alerted on. So this is definitely one of the biggest challenges that we are seeing from a technology perspective. Now, how to solve this? Well, the goal in general, and this is not only with identity, but the goal in general when it comes to cybersecurity is to strive to prevent and detect attacks while they are in their tracks, again, sooner or as soon as possible. So to do so, we need to shift left to try to stop the attacker as sooner as possible. And obviously we have, let's say, within our organizations, all of these capacities in one way or the other. Again, you might have your EPP and your EDR solutions, or your network detection and response, or cloud protection solutions. So I will call them cross-domain. That all fits into the extended detection and response that we know as XDR. So you have naturally the layers of prevention and the layers of detection for things like fileless. Eric mentioned exactly that, like living of the land, exploits, identity misuse, even legitimate one, by the way. And then going into the abilities of organizations doing cross-domain response, whether that is kill processes, quarantine a computer, reset the password, provide a conditional access challenge or an MFA challenge to a user that is under a conditional access policy, and eventually also being able to ingest other platform logs and telemetry into that XDR platform for a higher level of correlation, more deeper level of correlation, actually, for a broader orchestrated set of responses. So we could be talking about IAM, PAM, applications that you have within your organization, but also SASE and much more. The point here that is definitely missing more than we were wished for in many organizations is that component of identity, allowing them to shift left exactly the detection instead of waiting for all of those components to eventually get together and you stitching all of those loose siloed insights or telemetry into a possible incident. Now you're trying to do it exactly as the attack is beginning and trying to bring as much insights as possible for you to have an accurate pinpoint detection of what is happening within your environment. Again, like we mentioned before, as soon as possible. So what's basically here is, what needs to happen here is a shift away, let's say, from a typically only EDR-centric security model that we have been adopting over the last decades. We came from a preventative once more to assume breach model, but that was always very focused on the endpoint, and rightfully so. Again, there's a lot of it that is going to target the endpoints that end users are using, and endpoints move around with users, but identity should be at its core. In reality, identity should be at the core of XDR, right? But it's also important to mention that identity threat detection and response, and specifically, or in general, XDR, requires a strong EDR foundation. Securing the who, like that being the identity, and the what, that being the endpoint, should be equally important, but they can't actually work siloed, or they are not actually giving you the best of their value if they are working siloed. Right? Exactly because you're losing the context of the full-blown attack that is happening, like you're mentioned with phishing attacks that start with, and again, eventually credentials being stolen or dumped. Some of those things can actually be happening on an endpoint level, or they can actually be just happening on the cloud level, like the OAuth applications example, which I think it was scenario B, right? So once more, it's crucial for organizations to realize that it's important to have this end-to-end visibility and unification in between various cross domains of the security, specifically endpoint and identity. So now that we went through that, let me actually go through a bit of our view or our take of what organizations should do to modernize their identity security. These are evolutionary waves that one way or the other, we all have been through, some more than the others, depending on our ages and the age of our organizations, naturally. But it is important to mention that, and this is something I would really like to call out here, the importance of outcome-based resolutions, right? The North Star outcome, the North Star outcomes that we should be striving for all of our organizations should be, without a doubt, that business continuity and business resilience. And that's why cyber resilience actually is becoming the norm when we previously used interchangeably the term cybersecurity. So the outcomes that I just mentioned, which is resilience and continuity, is actually the outcomes that also SentinelOne focuses on, while ensuring that we don't deviate from the continuous innovations that we have done across each one of these evolutionary waves. Now, let me skip forward here the animations so that I can actually continue this. So as a collective, again, one way or the other, as I mentioned, we all went through this journey, right? Left to right. At the beginning was all about the device focus. Again, we're trying to build that preventative, those walls against our castle to prevent cyber criminals or attackers to get in. We quickly realized that that was not sufficient. And again, from an innovation standpoint of view, specifically at SentinelOne, we were very focused from an outcome point of view to reduce impact, device impact specifically, when we were focused on solving the AV problem. As we went into a incident focus, once more, assume breach mindset, it was all about detection and response. And to us, the biggest bet there was really to ensure that companies or organizations will be able to recover faster. And now that we are going into this trend of organization focused, XDR is at its core. And XDR is shifting basically the focus to a prevent and resolve one, where it's founded, it's still founded in the, I would say, protect and defend and detect and respond principles that we have in previous waves, but it's uniquely moving to a more data-centric model as the core resolution resource. So in the end, it should all be evolving around what we mention as augmentation of data, augmentation of tools, and augmentation of people. This is what will allow us to collectively walk towards that business continuity and resilience outcome. So if we have to give you some high-level core identity security recommendations, and actually going back to the slide where Eric showed several of those statistics, and how we actually mentioned at the beginning that Active Directory might be very easy to deploy. I'm going to make double quote because it's definitely not easy at scale, but also easy to use. Is highly pervasive, but it's often very difficult to secure. One of the biggest reasons, in my opinion, is the lack of visibility of what is the attack surface of your own identity. So if anything, the first recommendation would be exactly to ensure that you have a good baseline of what is the attack surface that you are exposed to. You know, this becomes even more important nowadays, given that identity is our perimeter. I'm not going to say it's the new perimeter because that is like old school. It is the perimeter. And we talked about also the expansion to cloud. So that expansion to cloud, not only from a business requirement point of view, but also from a technical requirement point of view, is often based on things like business to business, business to customer, and also supply chain. And that has a byproduct which directly and indirectly exponentially increases the attack surface. So once more, a lot of it is simply unknown. And I think this is the strong point that I want to pass to you is a lot of it is simply unknown, that you might be actually susceptible to be attacked on a given attack vector. So only when you know what is your attack surface based on things like insights on related to risk, criticality of attacks or exploitations, correlation with ongoing attacks within your environment, you will be able to efficiently do and execute an increase of your identity security stance. Now, one doesn't necessarily precedes the other or trumps the other, but generally speaking, obviously, I would recommend first focusing on reduction of attack surface before going directly into the protection of the identity infrastructure. But they can definitely go side by side. So when we mention protect identity infrastructure, we're meaning here is the lens of adding abilities to do threat detection and response into your identity infrastructure. And that is of a great deal of importance, exactly like we've done it for the endpoint. It's having the visibility and having the response capabilities when things happen, continuing that assume breach mindset that it's important to have top of mind without forgetting of the preventative and the proactive work of reducing the attack surfaces. Next, again, beyond attack surface management and ITDR, we have the in-network attack detection and insider threat mitigation. This is related to deception technologies. The ability to lure, deceive, and counter attack or counterplay attackers in real time, including insider threats, especially by adding the network elements for things like containment response capabilities and direct attack mitigation, is nowadays more than ever a key element for that identity security. And last but not least, going back to the principle that we've just talked, that independently, a domain, a security domain by itself will have less efficiency. It is important to cross it and correlate it with everything else that you might have within your organization. And that comes back to the XDR platform importance. Again, crossing it with the endpoint, your cloud, workload protections, and so on and so forth. All right, 1 second, just passing here for the slide. Now, if I have to eventually double click on the previous slide, here is a more structured approach for you to understand how to go and define a stage approach to your own organization. We've divided this into 3 levels or 3 layers. Naturally, the protection, which encompasses things like the privileged identity management that we so care about. Again, protecting those highly privileged identities to ensure that the attackers eventually won't have the ability to actually capture them. Ensuring that you have layers of multi-factor authentication to prove that the user is the user, but also to add second factors or more of authentication into the actual authentication process. And also being part of things like conditional access itself. When you see or spot suspicious behaviors happening and you want to ensure that it is really a legitimate user doing what they are doing. And last but not least, as I mentioned before, the attack surface management, which is all about creating the baseline, prioritizing things that you need to solve, and then tackle them. Moving on into the detect and response, that's all about identity detection, threat detection, I'm sorry, and response. And last but not least, the deception capabilities. Stitching all that together with a platform that is XDR, once more across all of these all of these security domains, including things like endpoint, productivity, SASE, cloud, and so on and so forth. Now, I would like to give you a sneak peek of what are the capabilities that Singularity XDR platform from SentinelOne has to offer you when it comes to identity security. Let's begin to actually explain to you a bit of what is Singularity platform. Our Singularity XDR platform is our end-to-end encompassing platform that not only allows us to provide you native surface coverage on core aspects or core surfaces like identity, cloud, and endpoint, but also cater for third-party security solutions that you might have within your organization through the extensibility capabilities that we have in our marketplace. It provides you native one-click integrations. Those integrations, by the way, they carry 3 core principles: threat fusion, augmented threat hunting, and orchestrated and autonomous responses. So first and foremost, we have very key principles, and we're paramount about making sure that customers have the best possible integrations with the solution that eventually they are using, whether it is once more from email, productivity, network detection response, and so on and so forth, without the need for you to build complex integration playbooks or including building your own parsers for the data, building the ingestion, building the correlations. That should be done as much as possible natively by the platform, and we are very paramount about it. Singularity platform, again, as the name implies, is that platform that allows you to realize more security without ignoring once more the importance of consolidating your security stack and giving you efficiency. So one of the core, actually some of the key highlights that I would like to give you on SentinelOne Singularity platform are things like the high availability multi-tenant, multi-site architecture. This is super key, especially for organizations that are distributed worldwide. Hosted in global data centers. So again, availability of that service. We have best in industry coverage across all main supported platforms like Linux, macOS, and Windows, and also mobile, by the way. Support for VDI, Kubernetes, cloud, and it's everything packaged into a single agent for EPP and EDR. Moving on, again, on top of that Singularity platform, and specifically for the identity surface, we offer you a triad model of identity security. That triad model is made up of Singularity Ranger AD, Singularity Identity, and Singularity Hologram. And I'll explain briefly what each one of those mean. So Singularity Ranger AD covers exactly the first pillar of recommendation, or the first area recommendation that we gave before, which is all about assessing the attack surface, the continuous assessment, by the way, of the attack surface of your own identity and within your own organization. So focusing exactly on covering all of the possible attack vectors that you might be susceptible to, in allowing you to have a list of prioritized key areas to improve in terms of security stance, regardless, by the way, if that is on-prem, which we saw that still many of you are using, hybrid, or simply cloud. Moving on, we have Singularity Identity, and this goes to the second pillar of our recommendation, which is the identity threat detection and response. And once more, like I mentioned before, both on-prem, hybrid, and cloud is supported by our Singularity Identity solution. Singularity Identity provides you both protection and detection capabilities directly where it matters the most. And I'm talking about things like your domain controllers and your domain joint endpoints, regardless of its OS, specifically for the protection that we can deliver at the domain controller. For Windows, we have the ability, for example, to even, together with our security deception technology, Hologram, to counterplay attackers and actually deceive them with the information they're trying to obtain, even locally at the endpoint. So Singularity Identity, by the way, also offers zero trust enforcement layers, and it actually pairs perfectly with Singularity Ranger AD that we've seen before, to benefit of another lens towards the prioritization of their risk of the attack surface. And last but not least, within that triad that I mentioned, we have Singularity Hologram. So Singularity Hologram is our deception technology, and it is an award-winning identity threat deception solution that is capable of offering luring and deception capabilities, forcing attackers to reveal themselves, containing them, by the way, through things like network level response capabilities, but also preventing them to actually gain access to secrets, to those crown jewels that Eric mentioned. That could be, for example, your privileged identity passwords or user passwords. Exactly because both from a domain controller and an endpoint level, we are able to deceive the results that the attackers might actually be trying to obtain, even from legitimate accounts. So overall, Singularity Hologram augments the ITDR, the identity threat detection and response, apologies, capabilities of Singularity Identity, because the detections that come out of Hologram will be of high fidelity, because we're talking about very specific areas of identity that will be set up specifically to lure and deceive attackers. And they will also provide additional context for deeper and more accurate correlation with Singularity Identity visibility. Which, once more, like I mentioned before, it all goes down the path of reducing false positives, reducing the overload that the SOC teams are often handling. And this is a slide that represents the 10,000 feet view of our Singularity XDR platform that shows both the breadth and the depth of not only the extensive surfaces that we protect, as you can see there, like endpoint, cloud, mobile, IoT, network, identity, and Active Directory, obviously, but also the extensibility capabilities that we have through our native marketplace integrations that I've mentioned previously, like the single-click integrations natively supported. And finally, our foundation for data ingestion, which offers you not only the ability to ingest XDR native data, including the native integrations that we have with other third-party security solutions, but also your own custom security data through our XDR platform ingest SKU that we announced recently. With it all, we are providing an end-to-end platform capable of telling you the full-blown story of an attack. And naturally through it, we are able to autonomously help you applying orchestrated response, mitigations, and things like rollback or remediation capabilities, like our rollback capability we have in Windows, which is a proprietary ransomware rollback feature. And that is that. We basically got to the end of this webinar. We would like to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Our hope is that we can eventually dig deeper into the details of our product and understand how its features and capabilities can actually be applied to your business and technology security requirements. That is it from my side. We can now go into Q&A. I'm going to open the Q&A panel. Is there anything that you want to eventually reply to, Eric, or have replied already?
Yeah, there's a good question in there for Scenario C. To reiterate for the folks out there, how does Scenario C first start, which is privileged identity that was compromised within a cloud environment. Oftentimes what you'll see is within an external application, whether it's a web app vulnerability or a critical software vulnerability, that'll get exploited. Or there's a credential, as I mentioned on previous slides, that is then used to access that application. And then there's, through a series of privilege escalation, that privileged identity then gets compromised. Good question, though.
Awesome. We have another question in our Q&A, which is, do you ever integrate with isolation products that don't rely on detection algorithms to reduce the detection load on the downstream products? I am honestly having a hard time understanding what is the core of this question. But if this is related to the capabilities of the identity security that we just shown you, there is naturally, from a network detection and response level, capabilities that Singularity Identity can offer to contain attackers while they are conducting their attacks. Exactly, if we see suspicious behaviors coming from specific devices, or even like trying to access specific resources, there are ways through VLAN, proxy, or firewall to actually contain those attackers. Hopefully this was to the point of your question. And we have no other answers, or I'm sorry, questions. So with that, Caitlin.
Yep, looks like it's the last one. So thank you guys so much for this session today. We hope it was very helpful for you all. And thank you again for joining, and have a good day.
Thank you all. Thank you.